Calling Five Nights at Freddy's just a horror game doesn't really work. In less than a decade, a small indie project made by one guy turned into one of the biggest pop culture forces of the last 10 years. And when something hits that hard online, Hollywood shows up sooner or later. But what looked like the perfect deal ended up becoming a problem. The adaptation got stuck in drama, constant rewrites, clashing egos, on-set issues, and studios that never fully understood the world they were trying to bring to life. Today we're getting into a story built on obsession, control, and years of frustration. Because long before The Last of Us or Sonic became the blueprint for game adaptations, this project was already there, stuck in the same limbo for over a decade. So whether you're into the game or just curious, hit that like button and get ready. We're about to break down the real story behind Five Nights at Freddy's. I'll be honest, when we first talked about making a video on this topic, I wasn't totally convinced. I knew the game, but the movie had completely passed me by, and when I checked the reviews and saw it actually had solid ratings on Google, I was surprised. So I gave it a try, and the story behind it ended up being way more interesting than I expected. We're used to seeing big studios push their teams to the limit to deliver the next massive release, and fans losing patience the second a launch gets delayed. But this story went in a completely different direction. Everything started with one guy who was unbelievably committed to what he wanted to make, Scott Cawthon. Born on July 26, 1978, in Houston, Texas, Scott grew up obsessed with video games and dreamed of creating his own. But unlike the classic garage genius with a startup behind him origin story, Scott was doing everything on his own. No team, no backing, barely any budget. Just a lot of faith that sooner or later something would work. For years he developed small games with simple visuals and religious themes. He put real effort into them, but they barely made a ripple. He created more than 70 titles, and if you've never heard of any of them, that's normal. They all went unnoticed, all except one. Back in 2013, Scott put out a small game called Chipper & Sons Lumber Company. It was meant to be a light, kid-friendly project about a young beaver helping his dad with building chores. Nothing dramatic, nothing edgy, but players didn't take it that way. Something about the characters felt off. Reviews said they looked expressionless, the animation felt stiff, and the whole game had this weird, unsettling vibe. One critic, Jim Sterling, even described it as accidentally scary. That reaction hit Scott harder than he expected. It got to the point where he seriously considered stepping away from game development altogether. But in the middle of all that frustration, a thought stuck with him. If people were reacting to something he didn't intend to be creepy, what would happen if he leaned into that on purpose? So he started digging around for ideas. He wanted to figure out why something designed for kids could end up feeling so uncomfortable. He revisited stories where cute and creepy overlap, and rewatching the Child's Play movies gave him a few hints. But the real spark came from a memory he never quite forgot. Those old pizzerias with animatronic mascots that were supposed to be fun, but always looked a bit too alive. He remembered places like Chuck E. Cheese's and Showbiz Pizza Place, massive in the 80s and genuinely eerie once you think back on them. With that idea in mind, Scott started building a new project, a place where these kid-friendly characters came to life after closing time, a pizzeria hiding something underneath it. That's where Five Nights at Freddy's began. The concept was straightforward. Monitor the security cameras for 5 nights and try to stay alive. Scott spent months working from home. He coded late at night, built all the 3D models himself, and used whatever tools he had access to. He didn't have a modern engine or advanced software, just his computer, coffee, and a lot of stubbornness. People around him kept telling him it wasn't worth the effort, that nobody cared about games like that anymore. But he pushed through anyway. He wanted to see if he could actually scare someone and create something that felt different. And remember, this was long before today's tech and AI tools made development easier. He used ClickTeam Fusion 2.5, a simple engine that was already dated by industry standards. His computer didn't help either. It crashed often, damaged files, froze animations, and more than once he almost gave up out of frustration. But he kept going. He coded through the night, slept a few hours, and took on small freelance jobs during the day just to cover expenses. He couldn't afford artists or sound designers, so he handled everything on his own. The animatronics, the audio, even the voice on the phone that guides the player. Later on, he also took care of the marketing and release by himself. Once Scott finished the game, he tried submitting it to Steam. But at the time, their greenlight system almost never approved projects with simple graphics. So it got rejected. That hit him pretty hard. He was worn out and second-guessing everything. But after putting in so much work, he wasn't ready to let it die. So he uploaded it to Desura, a small platform used mostly by indie developers. It was basically his last option. And somehow it worked. On August 8th, 2014, Five Nights at Freddy's finally went live. Scott was anxious and unsure of himself. After years of making small kids' games, he didn't exactly feel like someone who understood horror, but he was about to find out he was wrong. Within days, the game blew up. YouTubers started playing it, their reactions spread everywhere, and Freddy's name took off fast. Alongside games like Outlast and Amnesia, Five Nights at Freddy's helped bring horror back to the mainstream and proved something studios didn't want to hear. You didn't need a huge team or top-tier graphics to connect with players. A few weeks later, Steam changed its mind and approved the game. It launched for $5 and, without any marketing at all, became a massive hit. Creators started dressing up to play it, and fans immediately began digging for clues behind the animatronics in the world Scott had created. And that was only the start. As his haunted little pizzeria took over the internet, Scott had no idea that a much bigger force, one very real and very powerful, was closer than he thought. By the mid-2000s, Hollywood didn't have the best track record with video game adaptations. Studios had been trying for decades, and most attempts fell flat. Prince of Persia underperformed. Need for Speed barely broke even. And titles like Hitman, Max Payne, and Silent Hill Revelation were remembered mostly for how badly they turned out. At that point, adapting a game felt like a risky bet. But online, the story was completely different. Horror games were wrapping up their golden era on YouTube. Reactions, jumps, live streams, anything with a good scare pulled massive numbers. And just when that momentum was fading, Five Nights at Freddy's brought it back in full force. Unlike most franchises, Five Nights at Freddy's had something studios couldn't overlook. It didn't need help to grow. Scott released the first game in 2014, and within months, Game 2, 3, and 4 followed. Each one became a global event, and its fan base, young, active, and endlessly curious, kept the hype alive on their own. For studio executives, that meant one thing: movie potential. A $5 indie game was pulling more attention than full productions from major studios, and the audience behind it was very young. The exact demographic Hollywood had been trying to figure out for years. That's when the chase began. Studios started pitching offers and competing for Scott's attention. Meanwhile, he watched it all from home. Still surprised that people cared this much about his work. After so many years of failure, it was the first time he got to enjoy the moment, even if just a little. Out of all the names reaching out, one stood out above the rest: a giant studio that helped shape modern Hollywood and now wanted his project. When Warner Brothers entered the picture, Scott couldn't say no. He just didn't expect that this giant would become his biggest obstacle. In April 2015, Warner Brothers officially announced that it had picked up the rights to make a Five Nights at Freddy's movie. It was huge news, and the fandom finally felt a bit relieved. Warner wasn't new to this kind of adaptation. Over the years, they'd been behind titles like Mortal Kombat, Tomb Raider, and later on, Detective Pikachu. No matter how those films turned out, the studio at least had experience turning game worlds into something for the big screen. And with Five Nights at Freddy's, they had another advantage no one else had. The internet had already done half the work. Reactions, theories, breakdowns. There was so much fan content that you could practically build an entire franchise out of it. All Warner had to do was shape that into a first movie. The studio moved quickly. Under the lead of Roy Lee, Seth Grahame-Smith, and David Katzenberg, the project started taking form. These were people with history in both horror and successful adaptations, so everything seemed to line up. Not long after, they confirmed Gil Keenan, the director of Monster House and the Poltergeist remake, would direct and co-write the film with Tyler Burton Smith. At first, it all looked solid, but beneath the excitement, there was one small detail that would become the project's biggest problem. Scott was extremely protective of his story. This didn't mean he wanted to control every shot or force the studio to recreate the game beat by beat. What he wanted was simple, but hard to achieve in an industry with its own way of doing things. He didn't want the core of Five Nights at Freddy's to get lost. Scott wasn't a Hollywood writer, but he was very clear on one thing. He didn't want a movie that was just a string of jump scares. The clash between Scott's very specific vision and a studio used to shaping franchises their own way showed up early. Warner kept moving forward, but the project never really settled into anything clear. Drafts piled up, meetings kept dragging on, and Scott turned down almost every idea that came his way until the whole thing eventually stalled. By mid-2017, Warner walked away from Freddy's Pizzeria. They just couldn't make it through more than 600 nights dealing with Scott, and we'll never really know what kind of movie they were trying to make. Maybe something closer to Monster House. A mix of kid-friendly horror, dark humor, creepy animatronics, and an adventure vibe. Maybe it could have predicted the wave of game adaptations that hit later with Sonic or Detective Pikachu. Maybe Warner actually had something interesting. Either way, years of work were thrown out. Scott got the rights back and, little by little, started wondering if he had been too strict with the studio. But then something unexpected happened. Just when most projects would have died for good, Hollywood knocked again. Because while Warner was stepping away, another studio had been watching from the sidelines, a much smaller one, with a completely different view of modern horror: Blumhouse. What felt like a lost cause for Warner was exactly what Blumhouse was looking for. Unlike the big studios, Blumhouse doesn't rely on huge budgets or massive marketing pushes. Their formula is different. Smaller projects, strong ideas, and directors who know exactly what they want to make. Paranormal Activity, Insidious, Get Out. All of them proved you don't need a giant production to create something that hits. For them, Five Nights at Freddy's was an ideal fit. The only thing it needed was a studio willing to listen to Scott's ideas, and that's exactly what Jason Blum offered. In March 2017, Scott Cawthon announced that the adaptation had found a new home, and right away things felt different. Five Nights at Freddy's wasn't just another game. It was a project built by someone with a very specific vision and a close, unusual connection to his audience. From the beginning, Blumhouse did something Hollywood doesn't usually do. They put the creator at the center of the creative process. That's when the chaos started. Because from the very first draft, it became obvious how difficult this adaptation was going to be. The lore didn't follow a clear timeline, fan theories contradicted each other, and every corner of the community had its own idea of what the real story was. The real problem was simple. The movie had to juggle horror, drama, mystery, and a story that actually made sense. And once again, Scott wasn't satisfied with any of the drafts that came in. Nothing felt like his world. The project moved, stalled, restarted, and then circled back again. Some weeks looked promising. Others felt completely directionless. People came and went, ideas changed constantly, and the schedule kept stretching. Most studios would have seen that as a bad sign. But Blumhouse didn't. Then, in November 2020, Scott went on Reddit and finally admitted what had been happening behind the scenes. The movie had gone through more discarded scripts than anyone imagined. Some he wrote himself. Others came from big studios. A few came from well-known directors, and others from teams who tried every possible angle to make the story work. And the ideas were all over the place. Some drafts turned it into a basic teen slasher. Others started close to the game, and then spiraled into secret labs and military plots. At one point, Scott even tried adapting The Silver Eyes with Kira Breed Risley, but none of the three versions they wrote actually worked. There were smaller, stranger pitches too, like one where a kid ended up with a stolen animatronic from a pawn shop. A few drafts had good moments, but none of them were strong enough to move forward. Meanwhile, the fans were getting tired of waiting. Explanations didn't help anymore. And what Scott revealed made two things very clear. Hollywood didn't know how to handle a world built on mystery, and Scott wasn't going to accept anything that didn't match the tight, tense feel of the games. It felt like the movie would never happen until the pizzeria finally started coming together. It took 4 more years before someone showed up with a pitch strong enough to win Scott over: Emma Tammy. Tammy already had experience in indie horror with The Wind, and when Blumhouse considered her for the project, she did exactly what Scott needed. She went deep into the Freddy's universe, learned the lore, and pitched a version of the first game that didn't rely on the obvious scares. Instead of focusing only on the animatronics, she centered the story on the main character's grief and guilt, a more personal angle Scott had been trying to find for years. Once she presented that idea, the choice felt clear. Blumhouse saw someone who could work well with small teams, and Scott saw someone who understood his vision. From there, the studio brought in a writing team to lock down the final script. The early structure had been developed by Chris Lee Hill and Tyler McIntyre, 2 filmmakers from the indie horror scene who helped shape the first outline while Blumhouse was still exploring different directions. But the version that finally clicked for Scott was the one he wrote with Tammy, with Seth Cuddeback joining near the end to help tighten the story and give it the right tone. For the first time in almost a decade, Scott felt like the project was in the hands of people who genuinely understood the world he created. Tammy had already cleared the hardest part, getting approval from the guy who spent almost 10 years turning down every idea that reached him. But the rest of her job wasn't going to be easy. She had to balance 3 things that almost never worked together: Scott's very specific vision, a fandom ready to analyze every second of the process on YouTube, and the need to make a movie that regular audiences could understand. On top of that, the story had to blend genres that don't always fit cleanly: horror, mystery, family drama, and a bit of the supernatural. Even directors with decades of experience would have found that difficult. The good news was that Tammy had something in her favor. She was collaborative, open to feedback, and used to leading small productions. Exactly the kind of approach a project like this needed, especially with Scott involved in almost every major decision. But neither her emotional angle nor the updated script would end up being as important as the question that came next. How do you bring the villains of this story to life? From the start, Tammy made one decision that set the tone for the entire movie. The animatronics were going to be real. No fully digital creatures, no computer-generated monsters. She wanted Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy to exist the way fans imagined them, as physical characters inside a pizzeria, moving, breathing, and stalking just like they do in the game. With support from Blumhouse and Scott, Tammy reached out to one of the biggest names in practical effects, Jim Henson's Creature Shop. They're the team behind The Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, and dozens of iconic creatures in modern movies. If anyone could bring the pizzeria's animatronics to life without losing what made them unsettling, it was them. But the process wasn't easy. Each suit was built piece by piece, with internal mechanics, costumes, servos, and layers of detail to give every character its own personality. The goal wasn't just to make them look good on camera. They had to feel real enough that you could imagine them coming to life, and maybe even setting the set on fire. But we'll get to that later. With the director locked in, the script in place, and the animatronics under construction, the project was finally ready for its next step. All it needed now was the cast, the people who would go face-to-face with Freddy on the big screen. Let's recap for a second. They were deep into production on a movie based on a game where your only goal is to survive a group of murderous mascots. Mascots that a team of experts, led by the closest thing the industry has to a real-life Victor Frankenstein, was actually bringing to life on set. So the challenge became pretty clear. They needed actors who could hold their own next to 2-meter-tall robots with unblinking eyes. The first priority was Mike Schmidt. They needed someone who could carry the mystery, show vulnerability, and give weight to a story built around trauma and second chances. Blumhouse found all of that in Josh Hutcherson. Coming off The Hunger Games, he had the right mix of recognition, experience, and the emotional tone they wanted for the character. Then came the announcement that sent horror fans into nostalgia mode. Matthew Lillard had joined the cast. For a whole generation, he's Stumacher, the unpredictable villain from Scream. His ability to switch between charming and unsettling brought something unique to the project. Rounding out the emotional core of the story was Piper Rubio as Abby, Mike's younger sister. With the cast in place and the animatronics ready to leave the workshop, the production was finally set for the riskiest phase. It was time to face the real survival challenge: filming the movie. Filming began on February 1st, 2023, in New Orleans, Louisiana. And from that moment on, everyone knew this wasn't going to be a normal production. Using real animatronics brought a level of complexity Hollywood hadn't handled in years. No amount of planning could prepare them for how demanding that approach would be, or for the small fire that broke out later on. But we'll get to that. The art department understood that the set needed to feel like an abandoned pizzeria. Flickering lights, narrow hallways, moving cameras, and heavy metal characters hiding in the dark. Creating a space that looked worn, believable, and still allowed the crew to move around became one of Blumhouse's biggest practical challenges. They built the entire restaurant from scratch: the kitchen, the back rooms, the hallways, and the guard's office. Then they spent days aging the floors, dirtying the walls by hand, and adding details to make everything feel truly neglected. The animatronics, which looked playful in the workshop, felt completely different once they were on the actual set. They weren't light props or simple suits. Each head weighed about 15 pounds. The costumes took up a lot of space, and controlling them required up to 6 people inside and around each character. Every movement had to be perfectly coordinated. A single mistake could force the team to reset a moment they had spent hours preparing. Even when the animatronics were off, they never stopped feeling present. Their mechanisms made low sounds, their joints creaked when they were repositioned, and the shadows they cast made the hallways feel even tighter. Several actors said they didn't have to pretend to be nervous. The animatronics handled that for them. Josh Hutcherson even admitted he liked spending time around them in the dark to stay connected to his character. Coordinating all of that with the human actors was the hardest part. Any moment involving the animatronics required marks on the floor, very specific camera moves, exact reaction timing, and a level of precision that often meant running the same moment over and over. And all of it had to happen under a tight schedule that couldn't afford more delays. The release date was set, and neither the fans nor the Blumhouse team were willing to move it. But of course, the first rule of any production is simple. No matter how carefully everything is planned, something will go wrong. And on a set full of animatronics, that usually points in one direction: fire. Foxy, the only character built to work entirely as a machine, with no performer inside and no puppeteer sharing the space, overheated during filming. Unlike the others, which switched between internal mechanics and actors in suits, Foxy was used every day as a fully mechanical structure. That constant strain eventually caught up with it. One of the servos in its arm overheated, and the animatronic caught fire on set. The crew handled the issue immediately and no one was hurt, but the moment stuck with everyone who was there. It was a sharp reminder that sometimes reality ends up feeling scarier than anything in the script. The fire wasn't even the hardest part. The real pressure came from Scott. Just like when he made the original game, he stayed involved in every detail. He reviewed footage every week, sent notes from home, joined remote viewing sessions, and signed off on scene changes. Against all expectations, the production eventually found its rhythm. There were moments when the team would stop in front of the monitor, see the animatronics lit up on set, and finally understand what they were building. A movie that wasn't hiding behind CGI. The team also made sure to include the YouTube community that helped make the game famous. Popular creators appeared on set as background characters. MatPat showed up as a waiter, and 8-Bit Ryan appeared as a taxi driver. Small roles, but enough for the fandom to feel seen and appreciated. By April 2023, when the final take was called, the feeling across the set was the same. It hadn't been easy, but they had managed to create something that once seemed impossible. After 10 years, the project Scott started in his house had finally stepped out of the screen and into the real world. The date was locked in, October 27, 2023. When Five Nights at Freddy's finally arrived in theaters under Universal Pictures, no one knew what to expect. The project had spent years stuck in creative limbo, moved through 2 studios, survived endless theories, and carried a fanbase capable of analyzing every frame. And yet, when the lights went down and Freddy Fazbear appeared on screen, the phenomenon woke up again. The impact was immediate. A movie made on a modest budget, around $20 million, ended up earning close to $300 million worldwide. A number so unlikely it felt straight out of the game's lore. Surprising, improbable, and impossible to ignore. For the production team, that meant something unusual. Years of difficult development, discarded drafts, studio changes, and technical challenges had led to an opening that proved the risk was worth it. Almost overnight, Five Nights at Freddy's stopped being just a viral game. It became a cultural event, one that filled theaters, broke records, and brought back the long-running debate about video game adaptations. Some viewers felt the movie wasn't perfect. Others believed it was exactly what they had been waiting for. But the audience made one thing clear. Hollywood, which listens to box office numbers more than anything else, heard that message loud and clear. Blumhouse moved fast. Within weeks, the rumors started spreading. Interviews hinted at what was coming, and eventually the obvious became official. Five Nights at Freddy's was getting a sequel. This time, the team aimed higher, with a bigger budget and a clearer direction. The studio locked the date, December 5, 2025. With that announcement, a new era for the Freddy's universe officially began. The moment the first trailer dropped, social media exploded with frame-by-frame breakdowns, fresh theories, and comparisons to the original games. Josh Hutcherson is back as Mike Schmidt. Matthew Lillard returns too, and every fan knows what that means for the future of the story. Piper Rubio is back as Abby. On top of that, the cast now includes names like McKenna Grace, Teo Briones, Freddie Carter, Wayne Knight, and Skeet Ulrich. The story picks up a year after the first movie, in a town where the old pizzeria has been turned into a themed event called FazFest. But when Abby reconnects with the animatronics, a chain of events begins that unravels far darker secrets about the place's true origins. Meanwhile, the team behind the sequel promised something that immediately lit up the fandom. Even more complex animatronics and a wave of hidden Easter eggs for everyone who spent late nights decoding the lore on YouTube. Five Nights at Freddy's started as the solo project of a frustrated developer and somehow grew into something no one could have predicted. It became an online phenomenon, pushed through years of rewrites, survived Hollywood's chaos, and eventually made its way to the big screen. Its real legacy isn't just about scares or box office numbers. It's proof that in an industry ruled by massive franchises and unpredictable trends, there's still place for stories born in small rooms, built with stubborn dedication, and protected by the person who created them. Because just like in the game, the moment you think everything is over and the lights finally go out, Freddy shows up. Now I want to hear from you. Did the movie match what you imagined from the game? Have you already seen the sequel? Let me know down in the comments. Calling Stranger Things a cultural phenomenon honestly doesn't do it justice. Eleven and her friends didn't just win fans.